particular quotes from Board and Guth and Vilenkin relating that their theorem does prove that the universe began to exist. And in regards to the thing you mentioned about how it starts in a small closed 3 geometry, that was the first quote that I gave, where they still said it had a beginning. So I'm curious, if the universe did have a beginning, what do you think caused it?
I still think we don't have enough scientific information to. And I mean, I found information saying that those same people said that there was no necessary beginning starting point. I think that the new work in physics concerning the quantum gravity is potentially a very promising avenue.
Okay. In regards to morality, you and I have had a lot of conversations on this one, and I imagine we still will. You say that we can see people suffering, and because we can see people suffering, therefore we have an obligation to help them. I'm not sure how you make that jump, because it seems that on a naturalistic worldview, all that exists is matter, and on that worldview, we're just sort of relatively evolved primates, and we see, such harm going on within species all the time. Why is it that we suddenly have this obligation to promote people's good? Where does this obligation come from? What obligates us?
Okay, so I think that if we're able to recognize that there are creatures and they have a significant number of the same characteristics, and that those characteristics seem to warrant our being considerate of them, so that we can recognize that they can suffer, I think then what we're working with is not necessarily a naturalistic viewpoint, but a normative viewpoint. And it's a type, I think, of formula. And so the formula is not built on naturalistic principles. It's not built merely to describe the world. It's to tell us how we might react to it.
Right, and I understand that, but I'm having a hard time understanding where these obligations come from. So, when you have Hitler, who said, Jews are subhuman, and they have all the same features, by the way, that we do, and he goes, nope, we're not gonna tolerate them, and he goes and exterminates them, and we say, no, you're wrong. Where does that standard come in, where we can arbitrate that we are in fact in the right rather than just in a different opinion?
Right, okay, so look, if we can recognize that they have the same features which would constitute their moral considerability, and then we say...
Well, that's where you're losing me, though, is how certain features justifiably constitute moral considerability.
Okay, so there's two things here, I guess. When we're looking at a language and its relation to the world, we could always ask as an open question, because some words aren't going to refer rigidly to the world, but are going to refer loosely. They could refer to multiple different instances. We could always ask, is that an instance of affection? And it might be not immediately apparent. But if someone's swinging a bat at you, I think it's hard to say that, oh yeah, that's an instance of affection. And similarly, I think we can look at particular instances of human interaction and we can say, that's obviously bad for a person.
I agree, right? And so you kept affirming that we can recognize boiling babies is bad. Beating people with baseball bats, is bad. Granted, there's not like a justifying reason, like that person was trying to, attack you or your family, and so it's a self-defense, like if you add that in there. But in general, like for the fun of it, those sorts of things are bad. But I'm wondering where we get that from. In other words, like let's say that I want to harm someone. Who has the authority to tell me, no, you can't do that? Like, what gives anyone the authority to tell me that I can't harm someone? Where does that authority come from?
Well, okay, so if you're doing that and you recognize that there's no distinct difference between you and that other person, then you're acting in a way which you wouldn't think that they could in the same way act.
Say that again?
Okay, so you're asserting by doing that act that it's permissible, in a sense, to act in that way.
Yeah. On atheism, it seems to me. Because I'm matter and they're matter, and
Well, when
everything's probably determined anyway.
When you're acting in a particular way, you're asserting that it's permissible to act in that way.
Okay.
And if you wouldn't think that it's permissible for them to do the same thing, if you would protest them doing that, then you're asserting it's not okay, it's not permissible for them to do that.
Sure, I totally agree, but where would I be justified in saying, hey, you don't have the right to do that to me? In other words, where does that right come from? Like, what gives me value and rights?
Okay, so the fact that you are able to feel pain, the fact that you're able to have better qualities of life, I think makes you worthy of moral consideration.
Yeah, well, I mean, but like dogs can feel pain, but we don't hold them accountable for the things they do.
Well, and that's because they don't understand. However, I do think they are worthy of consideration.
Okay. Well, I don't understand where the obligations come from. Like, I can recognize that. Okay.
Okay, so actually, let's stick in the vein of morality. And
that seems to be our topic.
It does. So I'm skeptical that you could actually warrant saying, no, it's really wrong to hurt somebody, if it's not the case that that being has some features which make it so that it actually is worthy of that considerability. And it seems on the model you're using, you're saying it's wrong to hurt that being because of some features in some other being, that being being God.
Yeah, I agree, because I don't think that on an atheistic worldview where we are nothing but collocations of atoms, that we have features that imbue us intrinsically with moral worth. And so I am of the opinion that the reason why Homo sapiens are valuable in a way that other creatures are not, and so why we hold people accountable when they kill a person but not when they kill a chicken, even though a chicken can feel pain, is because that person has a value that is imbued to them from a God who has made them in their image. And so God is the ultimate good, God being the locus of value and being good. Things that resemble that goodness become good by association. And so us being in the image of God imbues us with a value that we don't otherwise have on naturalism. And that's where I don't see where that value can come from on naturalism. And moreover, God's commands can't be arbitrary, because God's I don't think that his commands determine morality, but he himself is the good, and his commands flow from his nature. And so his nature constrains what he can command or not.
Okay, there's a few things there. First, I think we can make a distinction between something being instrumentally good and intrinsically good. And
agreed.
It seems on the model you're using, it's only the case that because these objects are given these attributes from some external entity, they become intrinsically good. Persons are instrumentally good.
Yes, I think on atheism that persons are only instrumentally good.
On the model you're proposing.
On the model that I'm proposing, they've been imbued with intrinsic worth now.
And so it's a contingent fact rather than a necessary fact given the Constitution.
Yes.
Okay, so I disagree heavily with you there. I think that given the facts of their Constitution, given that they can reason, given that they can feel pain, given that they can have better or worse states of life, it seems like they're necessarily worthy of consideration.
I just don't see how you're making that jump.
Okay, so if we're going to say that there can be...
I mean, consider this too, right? Like, evolution gives you a defeater for even thinking that our moral perceptions are veridical, right? So, which just means true, if anyone's not up with philosophy speak. But on evolutionary theory, right, all of our behaviors and beliefs have not been determined in order to pursue or seek truth, but have been selected for on the basis of fitness. And so over the time, our certain behaviors, such as altruism and, helping out your tribe, were socially advantageous in the fight for survival. And so we have those our ancestors who had those features lived better, and so now we have them too as being their offspring. But there's no reason for us to think that those perceptions of the world are actually true. On atheism, at least, the only reason why we would have those perceptions is because they're suited for fitness. And so we couldn't even trust that our moral perceptions could give us truth. Conversely, on a theistic perspective, we have a means by which a God can ensure that our moral perceptions are in accord with reality as it really is.
Okay, so I think you're conflating atheism and a very strict sense of biology. You're insisting that we can't say that anything's of value, and that seems to be a leap which I'm not sure we can say is certain.
Well, I mean, think about, like, what is pain, right? Like, pain is a series of neurons stimulated in your brain, that are making you feel unpleasant, right? And there are other neurons that can stimulate in your brain to make you feel happy, right? But at bottom, it's just electrical impulses in your brain on either case. And so I don't see how these particular electrical impulses suddenly give this creature value and mean that it cannot be hurt, whereas the other ones don't. Because at root, they're ultimately the same thing. And I mean, Russell would agree with this, as well as, atheist like Sartre, Nietzsche, Russell, they all agreed that if you don't have a transcendent moral standard by which to judge the world, then everything in the world becomes relative. In other words, it's my moral beliefs versus your moral beliefs. And there's no standard that either of us can appeal to adjudicate who's correct. And on a theistic worldview, you have such a standard where you can say, no, that is wrong. And that is good. And you're not just appealing to, well, because I think it's wrong or because I think it's good.
Okay, so I think it's a fact of reason that we can recognize. And it's going to be similar in nature to mathematical reasoning to some extent. And whereas we can't see that our particular beliefs about empirical facts are always true, we can confirm that our reasoning is actually approximating the truth, at least, when we start to see that we can form our beliefs in mathematical ways.
Okay.
All right, so we now move to...
Sorry for my mess. I've got the book this time. Ready. Okay, so it's important to notice that in Mark's last speech, there was no discussion of the fine-tuning argument or of the argument from the immediate experience of God. In fact, there's been no answer to the fact that we can be justified in believing God exists based on our personal experience of him. And so there not being any refutation to that, I would carry that through, and that's one in favor of the theistic side. In addition, the lack of any refutation to the fine-tuning argument, pull that through, that's another argument in favor of the theistic side. And I addressed his objections to it in the speech before, where I was going a million miles an hour, which I apologize for. In regards to the Kalam, he says that quantum gravity is a growing field and it gives us a better mapping of the world, and maybe there will be a point when we have a beginning. The trouble here is that all of the evidence that we have in cosmology points to the fact of the universe having a beginning. Moreover, he hasn't addressed the philosophical argument against the impossibility of an actually infinite number of things existing. So on philosophical grounds, we have reason to believe that the universe existed. Moreover, he hasn't addressed the thermodynamic argument against the past eternality of the universe. Namely, if the universe were infinitely old, then we should be observing an infinitely old universe with a heat death. Well, I mean, we wouldn't be alive to observe that, but that's what should be going on if the universe were, in fact, infinitely old. That hasn't been refuted either. Then in regards to this quantum gravity thing, in a personal communication of Vilenkin, he notes that these quantum gravity models are in fact not past eternal in the universe. He says, I understand that a universe of zero... sorry, that's him coming from nothing. Dang it, that's the wrong quote. Anyway. Anyway, if you recall, earlier, Vilenkin spoke in very strongly terms about when people ask him if the theorem that he put together with Board and Guth, it denotes a absolute beginning of the universe. He said, yes, it does. And that's from the very guy that he's appealing to. He's one of the foremost experts in loop quantum gravity and quantum tunneling, and he's the one who said that the universe cannot be existent in the past but must have had an absolute beginning. So he's simply wrong there, and unless he can cite some evidence otherwise, I don't know why we should believe that claim, unless you already believe it, which is just begging the question. Then he says, let's see here that it's only the beginning of inflation. I disagree. The Borg-Guth-Vilenkin theorem was meant to show that chaotic inflation had a beginning, but chaotic inflation is currently the most predominant model in cosmology, and Vilenkin, in a paper that he delivered on Stephen Hawking's 70th birthday, like 2 years ago, listed all of the current cosmological models that fall under the theorem, and loop quantum gravity was one of them. And additionally said that I haven't given him reason to believe that the cause of the universe is a person. I'd say there are 3 reasons here. I only gave 1 in my opening speech. The first is that this cause, whatever it might be, must either be a scientific explanation or an agent-based explanation. Seeing as there were no scientific forces in operation at the absolute beginning, it cannot be a mechanistic or scientific cause. It must be a personal cause. Additionally, when we look at what this cause must be, the attributes that it has of being timeless, spaceless, immaterial, changeless, unimaginably powerful, the only things that we know that fit that category are abstract objects, which are timeless and spaceless, like numbers, but numbers don't cause anything to happen, or an unembodied mind. So given that there's the only 2 things possible and it can't be the numbers, then it would be the unembodied mind. If Mark thinks that there's another possible cause there, I would like him to put it forward. Third, the idea that you have a timeless cause giving rise to an effect that begins is very interesting, because if it was an impersonal cause, then as long as the cause is present, the effect is present. And so if the cause is timeless, or eternal rather, then the effect should also be eternal. But that's not what we see. We see an effect that begins from a timeless state. And the only way to justify that is if the cause has the freedom to bring a new effect about, which would make it a personal cause. Moving on to the moral argument, which you saw us go back and forth in cross-X. Essentially, Mark's argument here is that we can recognize that people are in pain, and that therefore obligates us to help them. Now, I agree, when we recognize that people are in pain, we feel an obligation to help them. But the question is why? There has to be a justification for that. What on a naturalistic worldview, when we are just evolved primates, obligates us to act in a certain way? In other words, I can recognize when someone is suffering and when someone is flourishing, but why am I objectively, independent of what I want, obligated to promote that person's flourishing? I agree that I perceive that I ought to, but the question is, what is the explanation for that perception? And on an atheistic worldview, you have this undercutting defeater of evolutionary theory. Moving on to the problem of evil, he says, so God is a consequentialist, principles are more relevant. I agree that many of God's principles or reasons are probably based on principles, not merely consequences. Moreover, he says that this could justify nihilism. I disagree. It's the other view where there's nothing intrinsically valuable about us that would justify moral nihilism. On the other hand, when you have a supreme good that issues commands in alignment with his nature, there's no way that you can contradict those commands. Those commands are the moral law, and so the theistic worldview is not nihilistic. And then finally, on the Jesus thing, there's more than just multiple independent attestation. There are other criteria to look at as well, and he didn't answer the hallucination hypothesis. I should have given more time to get to that, but in my closing remarks, I will.
Okay, so first, in your opening speech, you made the qualifier that personal sentiments concerning the existence of God weren't themselves an argument. And here, I think it's important to realize that there might be multiple reasons we have these sentiments. And some of those could be explained by biological facts. Some of those can be explained by the fact that it's going to be evolutionarily advantageous if we're sometimes superstitious, if we sometimes posit there being a tiger in the bush even when there isn't, when the Russell being there might help us sometimes preserve our own existence. Second, on the argument from fine-tuning, my argument to begin with was that if we cite the universe being as it is as improbable, we shouldn't justify it being that way by citing something further, something more improbable. If it's the case that we're saying, well, the universe is the way it is because there's something which could have made it vastly different than it is, then we're saying the universe is the way it is for something far more improbable. And I don't think we're warranted in making that leap there. Concerning statements about there being a personal force creating the world that's both atemporal and immaterial, I think we don't have the scientific evidence to back the claim that first, personal forces can be immaterial. Second, if we're claiming that it's atemporal, there's something strange going on, because we can't explain then how it might move from one state to another. We can't explain how it might have a thought, for instance. We can't explain how it might act on some particular motivation. Those are going to be problems, I think, for that explanation. Second, then, or on concerning moral reasons, I think we can say that we have impartial reasons. There are reasons which we share with other people. There are reasons which stem from our shared constitution. If we recognize that something is harmful to a person, and it would be equally harmful to our interests if an act with similar properties were performed upon us, then we can recognize that this would be something which we have no moral reasons to wish upon that person. It's because of the similarity that we can have, that we share between various other humans and various animals, that we can recognize that we can constitute a moral community. And this, I think, is possible without a very extravagant metaphysics. We can see that it's possible for us to realize, given this shared constitution, given these shared similarities, that we should be concerned not only with our own outcomes, but with their outcomes too. Let's see. Okay. Thank you. And thank you all for coming out tonight. It's been lovely.
Thank you. Okay, in this last speech, I'd like to pull some of the major thoughts together and see how this debate has panned out. First, it's important to recognize that in his last speech, we didn't see any mention of the problem of evil there. And so on balance, when we look at the way the arguments have gone tonight, we've seen that there are 5 arguments for theism, which I've been periodically defending with reason and evidence. And there's been 1 argument for atheism, which has not been brought up and that I've answered. So if you're at all, thinking about this view, I would say that the best you could go for would be agnosticism, which would be if none of the arguments that I presented were successful. But let's see if that's actually the case. On quantum gravity, in his last speech there, he didn't talk about the universe not being able to begin again. We still didn't see any refutation of the thermodynamics reason or the impossibility of an actual infinite. So we have good reasons philosophically and scientifically to believe the universe began to exist. Moreover, he said we don't have scientific evidence in regards to this causal force. I disagree that we need scientific evidence of something to believe that it exists. I think Mark would agree here. He believes that morality exists on non-scientific grounds, but on his personal apprehensions. And so, on the same vein, I think we believe that logic exists and that we exist as persons. All of these are things that cannot be empirically proven. And so I think it's presumptuous for us to say that if something cannot be empirically demonstrated, therefore it should be ruled out because we have good counterexamples. examples to it. He said, how could this be? How could this thing have thoughts? Thoughts don't necessarily take time. You can have many thoughts without actively believing them. God can timelessly know many truths in one instant without having to think them discursively. There's no incoherence there. On the moral argument, he says in this last speech very clearly, we can recognize that we don't want other people to hurt us, and that gives us empathy for them. Yes, I completely agree. But there's nothing in that that therefore obligates me to help them. It can explain why I feel empathy for them. I can even have prudential reasons as to why I might want to help them because I don't want them to hurt me. But there's nothing objectively that someone could say you're failing in your moral duties to help them because of X, because you failed to do X. I can always respond, who are you to tell me that I need to do that, right? That's one of the main problems with the naturalistic worldview on morality. He says it's possible for us to realize that we should be concerned with other people's outcomes. Just because it's possible for us to realize that we can be concerned with other people does not therefore justify a jump to say that we ought to, right? Just because it's the fact that we do have that empathy does not justify to say that we ought to therefore act on it. On the fine-tuning, he said, we can't justify this hypothesis with something even more improbable. We haven't seen any arguments to think that God is an improbable explanation of the fine-tuning. Moreover, I explained that the improbability of the fine-tuning doesn't stand on its own, but it's conjoined with an independently given pattern. And it's when you have those two things, a remarkably high improbability aligned with an independently given. Get back to a point that he made earlier. Maybe Christians made this up to get power. If you know anything about the early church, they were doing nothing but getting killed for 300 years. So there's no way that they were promoting this in order to try and make a power play. They were having to die for their conviction in these beliefs. So you can't explain it that way. And so all through this debate, I don't think we've said any good defeaters for the arguments that I've presented. And so on all of those grounds, I think it is far more plausible based on the origin of the universe from nothing, that it must have a personal cause, the improbability of its popping into existence from nothing fine-tuned, the reality that there is an objective law outside of ourselves that we are accountable to and that we all feel it, as well as the resurrection of Jesus and our personal experience of God. We are more than justified, and I would say it is far more reasonable to conclude that God exists, especially when we have not seen any comparably good arguments from the other side. The most that we've seen is trying to tear down the case that I presented, but I've just been defending that all the way through. Finally, I would encourage all of you, if you are someone who is seeking God, God has been a reality that has absolutely transformed my life. When I was at Chico State, I was really wrestling with these big questions. And when I called out to God, I got an answer. And I was addicted to drugs. I won't go through the laundry list of them, but in one day, I was set free from all of them and filled with a love and a joy that you could not imagine. And on that personal experience, I know that Christ is true, and it's been great to see that it's demonstrated true as well. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in knowing God more, pick up a New Testament for yourself and read it. And I think you'll be really amazed at what you read. Thank you.
Okay, so with regard to the claim that the universe began to exist, I think we can say that the growth of the universe began to exist. We can say that definitively we can see signs that there's a point at which it started. However, I don't think we can say that we're certain that there was nothing prior to that, particularly when there is so much work being done in these contemporary fields of physics. You claim that thoughts could be atemporal, and there's something a little bit strange there that I think we might want to consider. If it's the case that in order to have a conclusion you have to have prior thoughts, then you can't have the conclusion before the prior thoughts. You could have a model which demonstrates the relation between those, but you couldn't actually arrive at true conclusions without first having the prior thoughts. You can't have an investigation without those things. You can't have something which actually looks like a thought that we find in the world. That's going to be something where the language is being bent in a certain way to force a metaphor through, I think. The argument from evil, I think, doesn't go away. It, once presented, is a rather pressing problem, because if we realize that it's the case that we want to claim God has these particular attributes of being omniscient, omnipotent, and good, then when we recognize that it's also the case that there are gratuitous evils, and I don't think we should just try to push those out the door and say there might be a reason for that, then it becomes very hard to make that view coherent. And I don't think that can be done. When we realize that something has no justifying reason, when it can't be made the case that we can provide a principle for it, when it comes out as a consequence, look, it might be better later, then there's something a little bit weird going on. If we can achieve the same consequent states, if we can achieve the same understanding by different means, if we could have been constructed differently, so that perhaps we had a better memory, so that perhaps we had an ancestral memory, so that these questions weren't so open to begin with. If it was obvious, and it seems rather clear that these could be less open questions, it could be the case that we all had better access, and it seems that then we're attributing a sort of strange characteristic to God, and that is namely a characteristic that seems to be present in kind of primitive human behavior. That's the characteristic of liking spectacle. And it seems like here we're claiming that in some cases it might be the best explanation that God has an affection for spectacle. See. I think that there's going to be a certain gap in our moral language and the objects which our moral language applies to in the world. And it's going to be something which we have to see. It has to be, in some sense, empirical. It can't just be the case that we stipulate something is there. And I think that's what happens when we appeal to a God for morality. We either have to stipulate something's the case and then reject that other claims can be a better explanation for that. And then we operate on the principle that we can always ask whether something's good. And that seems to end up with always justifying a point of skepticism. But that same rigor isn't employed on the other end when we say, well, it's because of God. And that should be cause for concern, because it seems like we're no longer employing the same rigor which we do in one spot as we do another. That lack of uniformity in our inquiry is something that should be concerning to us. And I think it's something which should prevent us from making the leap to saying, well, here's the explanation. It's God. We should want to understand the world better. And when we start to look for explanations, then the area which God is going to fill in our explanations is going to diminish, I think. And I think when that happens, we'll also have a better understanding of the world as it is.